Dopo 20 anni che lavoro in questo mestiere, mi rendo conto che non c'è una risposta scientifica per tutto. E questo ne sono certo. C'è qualcosa in più.
Used an anesthetic drug known as ketamine, which is a dissociative anesthesia and has LSD kind of reaction. But that was not the case. And my first reaction as a out-of-body experience was that I was not only present in the operating room, but I could also sense and see my mother and my sister in India. Remember is the joke told by an anesthesiologist. I can't repeat the joke, but he verified with me in the recovery room that he did tell the joke. But his reaction was, maybe you were light in anesthesia. But my question was, if I was light in anesthesia, I should have been hurting too. But I was not hurting. And from there, my consciousness traveled to different realms.
And that really was the beginning of my trying to figure out what had happened to me. I needed to know what had happened, how this had happened. And I wanted to find a medical scientific explanation. I was desperate to find an explanation. I knew that if I could find a reasonable scientific explanation, then, sadly I'd have to discount the fun part of my experience. But I knew that then I could discount everything I'd been told, including what I'd been told about my son's coming death. And so I was pretty motivated.
I fully expected that when you died, something would happen to tell you. Bells, whistles, who knows what. But there wasn't. It was just a very natural progression of, I was in this state this second, and the next second I was someplace else. I went from being in a physical form to being in a spiritual form.
Dopo 20 anni che lavoro in questo mestiere, mi rendo conto che non c'è una risposta scientifica per tutto. E questo ne sono certo. C'è qualcosa in più che non ti saprei spiegare, è qualcosa che io sento, che è una cosa molto mia, personale, che è solo del fatto che sono un medico. Avanti centrale.
Qui da 10 Charlie 2 arancione a Colderere.
Compreso centrale. Tenetevi forte, ragazzi. La parte che più mi ha impressionato come medico è stata un'esperienza vissuta in Spagna di un paziente turco che si trovava in una nave una sera che ero di guardia. Questo paziente aveva un infarto miocardico acuto. Quando l'ho visto, ho visto i suoi occhi, ho visto il suo dolore fondamentalmente, e già l'atmosfera che si respirava lì dentro era un'atmosfera molto particolare. Quando lui andava in arresto, è andato in arresto 4 volte, l'abbiamo defibrillato almeno quella sera 6-7 volte. Abbiamo dato queste scariche elettriche, lui si riprendeva, guardava, e io ho sentito questa sensazione. Una sensazione che non si può descrivere con le parole, è proprio una sensazione di questo vento, questa sensazione l'abbiamo vissuto tutti. Il farmaci che prende? Per un po', diciamo posto sicuro. Sì, andiamo a guardare il centro. Bella firma, possibilmente un angolo che ha avuto Alessandro, però dobbiamo portare il paziente in fondo, e questa è la cosa che più mi ha colpito, no? Dopo quando lui è uscito dal coma, e sono andato a visitarlo, a salutarlo. Lui non si è meravigliato di tutto quello, mi ha detto: ma io sentivo, vedevo quello che voi facevate. Dico, ma come? Però lui ha descritto le scariche, ha descritto quello che noi parlavamo con il gruppo, ci vedeva da sopra, ovviamente. È stata una sensazione che mi ha messo in crisi, anche come uomo di scienza e come umano. Il mio nome è Cesare, sono un medico d'urgenza e vi racconterò la mia esperienza pre-morte a seguito di un grave infortunio che ho avuto in Venezuela. L'anno scorso sono andato in Venezuela, nel mio paese, con la mia famiglia. Ci siamo accampati proprio in mezzo alla natura, quando eravamo nella Gran Sabana, e abbiamo dormito in tenda. Alla mattina sono uscito dalla tenda scalzo e camminavo, ho sentito qualcosa nel mio piede, mi ha fatto molto male e ho visto che ero stato morso da qualcosa, ecco. Non sapevo in quel momento cosa era successo, soprattutto che ero stato morso. All'improvviso mi sentivo molto male. Ho detto al guardiano, a quello che ci accompagnava nella jeep, di dirmi cosa era successo, perché non mi sentivo bene, che ero stato morso da qualcosa. E in quel momento lui mi ha visto e molto preoccupato mi ha detto: Signor, creo che lo mordió una serpiente de cascabel. Signore, penso che l'ha morso una serpente a sonaglia. Ho fatto un shock anafilattico da avvelenamento sistemico, sono andato in arresto respiratorio, dopodiché sono andato per più di un minuto in arresto cardiaco e sono stato rianimato in prima sul luogo, empiricamente. E dopodiché, quando sono arrivati i medici dell'esercito, hanno attuato una terapia d'urgenza, il quale ringrazio ancora adesso che sono vivo, grazie a loro. Io ho perfettamente il ricordo di quello che mi hanno fatto. E ti posso descrivere perfettamente quello che dicevano. Dicevano i medici che c'erano lì dell'esercito venezuelano, dicevano: lo estamos perdiendo, se va, este hombre se va, lo stiamo perdendo, quest'uomo se ne va. E io vedevo dall'alto tutta questa scena di mia moglie, i miei figli in panico totale, il mio stato di incoscienza, questo tubo orotracheale che mi hanno messo per farmi respirare o darmi la ventilazione controllata. Vedevo tutto e sentivo tutto. Mi sentivo come se fosse il regista di un film, vedevo tutto dall'alto e sentivo. Dopo, quando sono andato in ospedale universitario, la mia sorpresa più grande è stata parlare con i medici che mi hanno salvato. E gli ho descritto a loro: senti, ma io mi ricordo questo, vi vedevo, hai fatto questo atto, ti sei comportato così, hai detto queste parole, questi sono i miei ricordi. Loro mi hanno guardato e mi hanno detto: guarda, questo è impossibile perché tu eri in arresto respiratorio, in incoscienza e in arresto cardiaco. Sì, è vero, abbiamo detto questo. Io, dopo la morte di mio figlio, che aveva 5 anni, lui è morto su un evento tragico. È cambiato radicalmente la mia percezione della vita. E anche se sono passati 20 anni, lui rimane sempre presente nel mio pensiero, nel mio cuore ogni giorno. È qualcosa che sento e mi fa sentire bene. Quando io rianimo una persona, ogni qualvolta smetto che non sono riuscito a riprendere, a riacciuffare questa vita, questa anima, e riportarlo nel suo corpo, gli chiedo a questa persona, a quest'anima, se vede mio figlio, digli che suo papà gli vuole tanto bene, perché io non ho avuto il tempo, quando lui è morto, di dirgli quanto gli volevo bene.
Dr. Party, I'd like to thank you for consenting to this interview.
It is my pleasure to be here.
Okay. Dr. Party, you recently gave a talk at South Bay IANS, your account of your own near-death experience, and I'm wondering if you could talk to us about it now.
Yeah, my near-death experience happened about 3 years ago. It was an experience which changed my life forever in multiple ways. I became a happier, healthier, and a more peaceful person. It started with prostate cancer surgery about 5 years ago, and after that I had complications from prostate cancer surgery. And the biggest complication which I had to manage every day was incontinence. And 2 years after the original surgery, it was not getting better, so a doctor at UCLA Medical Center decided to put an artificial sphincter and a device inside me so I could control my bladder function. And that was originally done on the 14th of December 2010. The surgery went fine, but 2-3 days after the surgery, I started having very high fever, redness, swelling. I could not go to the bathroom at all. I was becoming very septic. Originally, the doctors tried IV antibiotics, but they were of no use because I was getting severely infected. So my wife had to rush me to UCLA hospital on Christmas Eve. And then they had to rush me to the emergency surgery to take the device out because it had become the source of infection. So when general anesthesia was induced, about 10 to 15 minutes later after the general anesthesia was induced, I saw myself floating about 10 to 12 feet above the operating table on the left side. And me being an anesthesiologist, my first reaction was, how is this possible? Did somebody put any LSD in my anesthesia? Or somebody used an anesthetic drug known as ketamine, which is a dissociative anesthesia and has LSD kind of reaction. But that was not the case. And my first reaction as a out-of-body experience was that I was not only present in the operating room, but I could also sense and see my mother and my sister in India. They were sitting in the lounge there, and it was evening time there, and they were having general discussion. My mom was wearing a green sari and a green sweater, and my sister was wearing a blue jean and a red sweater, which after 2-3 days of me getting better, I called and verified it. And in the operating room, I saw myself being cut and the infected fluid coming out, which was very awful smelling. One thing I distinctly remember is the joke told by an anesthesiologist. I can't repeat the joke, but he verified with me in the recovery room that he did tell the joke. But his reaction was, maybe you were light in anesthesia. But my question was, if I was light in anesthesia, I should have been hurting too. But I was not hurting. And from there, my consciousness traveled to different realms. The first realm it traveled to was a very hellish realm. It was pitch dark, there was thunderstorm, there was lightning, and there were very dark entities with crooked teeth running about, and I could hear different souls crying and wailing. Then I was made to lie on a bed of nails, and I was kind of tortured. My first reaction was, why am I here? And I asked them to stop. And I asked for anybody who could help me out. And then, after I realized why I had been here was because I had been a very mean person, a very unloving person, and not caring and getting ahead in life no matter what it took was my... And then my father showed up, and he led me from the hellish realm towards a tunnel on where there was a bright light outside. And during the tunnel, traveled through the tunnel, I had review of my present life, which had started in the hellish realm. Then I had the review of my good part of the lives too, where I have been helpful to the people. But most amazing was, I was greeted by 2 young, robust men. They were full of peace but full of strength. And telepathically, they told me they were my guardian angels. And they were Raphael and Michael. Now, it was very surprising to me being a Hindu, how could the angels showed up? And when I told my wife's first reaction was, what happened to thousands of Indian gods and goddesses? None of them showed up. And from there, I was guided by the angels towards a meadow. The meadow was beautiful with roses of different colors. A clear water stream was flowing, and there was sweet smell to the air. And there was a distant chant which sounded like Om or Ang to be correct, which I later on found was a primordial form of Om. And then as I went higher and higher in the realm, and then I woke up with a jolt in the recovery room. My first reaction was to go down on my knees and thank heaven for the experience I had, but I could not get up. Obviously, I had bandages around me. And after my NDE, I got better within 72 hours that I was ready to be sent home on oral antibiotics. My addiction transformed me in multiple ways.
Dr. Party, who was the first person that you talked to about your near-death experience, and what was their reaction to it?
The first person I talked to the near-death experience was briefly to the nurse, because my family was still not there, that I had experienced that I was out of my body. And the recovery room nurse, but she was very busy. She, in the beginning, like once the patient comes here, they have to be very... It was my wife who had talked to her. She was startled in the beginning, but on seeing my reaction, that how real I was, then she started believing that something really happened. And as the time went, as the things started happening on their own, and my nature changed, she became more believing in it.
What was your reaction to the near-death experience immediately upon coming out of anesthesia? So this experience made you less materialistic and more spiritual?
Oh, exactly.
Can't you be both?
One can be both. One can be if one is in balance. But mine was a runaway materialism. Like I built a house more than I could afford. I was keeping up with the Jones. But if it is in balance, one can have both. But it has to be balanced. But mine was other extreme of materialism.
So you really got no satisfaction out of it?
I got no satisfaction. It was like an emptiness which could not be filled by no matter how many toys I bought.
Mm-hmm. So why do you suppose you pursued this materialistic lifestyle?
The part of it was like I came from a very middle class family, and I'm a first generation immigrant, and it is very typical of first generation immigrants to to prove themselves and to prove to the society that it was worth living your own country. I was caught in materialism, and then all my friends were building bigger and bigger houses. So keep up with my friends, I built a bigger house, which was very hard. Your medical school training is atheistic because we try to find every solution by a neurophysiological chemical reaction. Like that's how the drugs work, and that's what the basic concept of consciousness is, as it is a byproduct of electrical and chemical reactions in the brain.
So you experienced something that was completely counter to that.
Exactly.
Could you talk to us about how do you feel about that? How do you feel that consciousness can be different from brain function?
Yeah, like this concept of consciousness being separate from the body was, in the sense of growing up as a Hindu, I kind of believed that, because we are born with the concept of rebirth, we are born with the concept of reincarnation, we are born with the concept of taking our karmas from the previous lives. And so it was not something new, but when I experienced it myself, then I became a very firm believer in it. Before that, I was agnostic regarding this, whether it exists before or it does not exist. It did not play a role in my life.
Right. If, your state of consciousness during this near-death experience was not clouded at all. If you were to take your anesthesiologist's word, then your consciousness should have been muddled, but you could see, you could hear, and you could smell. Not only could you still retain those senses, but they were actually more enhanced. Is that true?
They were more enhanced, more acute. And the thing is that I was not in pain. If I was light in anesthesia, I should have been in pain. I was not light in anesthesia, and my senses were totally intact. And that surprised me in the beginning. And that's why my thought was, maybe he used a different kind of anesthesia on me.
But he didn't.
He didn't. And there was no reason. That we use anesthesia. Ketamine is we used on small children to change the dressings during burns. That's the indication for it.
So how is it possible that your consciousness was enhanced?
I guess it was outside the body, and that was the experience of NDE, because it was pure consciousness. and it became enhanced. It has no limitations.
Also, during your near-death experience, I think you met your father, and he told you something. I think he said, keep your consciousness clear,
Yeah.
be truthful to yourself, and the divine will take care of you.
Yeah.
And talk to us a bit about how you saw your father in this near-death experience.
You know, like the words my father's used, if you are clear, no, my father said, keep your consciousness clear and be truthful to your own self, the universe and the divine will take care of you. These were the exact same words he had used about 20 years ago when he had complications from heart surgery in Fresno. Like an ethereal body, he looked much younger, and my father was actually in a way in a white clothes, and he loved to wear his uniform.
You experienced a telepathic knowing with the light. What kind of familiarity did you feel with the light? Did you feel that this was not something new, that it was more of a how can I put it?
Coming home.
Coming home, yeah.
I felt like coming home. I felt like I was part of the light, but I was separate from the light. It may sound paradoxical, but it was both feelings at the same time. The best I can explain is that I felt like consciousness was a pure ocean, and I was a small wave in the ocean. I'm separate. Wave is separate from the ocean, but still a part of the ocean. Mm-hmm. That's the feeling I had.
I'm wondering, why would a near-death experience make people more loving and less materialistic? What happens to you in that experience that causes this to happen?
The biggest thing I can say is because when one is in the presence of the light being or in presence of the light, all one can feel is, or experience is love. And that love is what the person who had NDE brings back. Because the feeling is there that the essential nature is love of the pure consciousness. And the love is not just a love between husband and wife, but love which is very hard to describe, is more to feel, is kind of unconditional.
Mm-hmm. How has this experience changed your view of death? For example, if someone very close to you passed away, what would you think and feel?
I had my sister's son, about 21-year-old, passed away 2 years ago after a car accident. And it was very painful for my sister, and it was painful for the whole family. We felt bad because he was physically not here. But at the same time, I tell my sister, he's still in this universe. Maybe his birth at another place, or maybe you can...
Do you think it's possible for let's say, a medium to communicate with your past relative and pass on messages to you?
I think it's possible. It is very possible. And I have been to a medium, and that medium did say some things that he got my father. He said my father is here, and did provide certain details which he couldn't have found out from the internet or somewhere else,
right,
about my childhood or something like that,
yeah,
and which only my father knew.
But of course, you have to be very careful about what medium you see, because so many of them are frauds.
I 100% agree with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I'm reading a book recently I purchased by Dr. Raymond Moody.
And I suppose my own transformation began really in medical school. I grew up as a child of the 50s in the Midwest, and I went to Sunday school, I went to confirmation, I did all those things. But back then, for me at least, it had nothing to do with spirituality. It had nothing to do with what really matters. And it had everything to do with, that's what you do on Sunday morning. You go to church. And I never really claimed it for myself. And then when I went off to college, I did what most smart, intelligent, accomplished people do. I said, okay, that spiritual stuff, that's not for me. I mean, I fully subscribe to the religion of the intellect. And I was probably somewhere between a humanist and a rationalist. But regardless, I absolutely accepted this false choice that we're asked to make, which is you either believe in science or you believe in spirituality. I said, oh, count me in with the science. And so that's how I remained for many, many years. Although in medical school, I think the door started opening just a little bit. Because when I was in medical school, I started really understanding the exquisite detail and intricate interconnectedness of every part of not only our body, but the world, the living world. And so I think deep inside me, there was this little question mark about, wow, is it statistically possible that this is all random, that it's all chance? And over the course of that time, I did also come across a few patients who, at the time, I had no idea what they were talking about, but they shared with me things that were happening to them, whether they were young kids who knew they were going to die during the next operation and told me about the angels who had come to take them. And I will tell you, back then, as now actually, I just sort of went, I don't know about that. That's a little out there, and kind of filed it away. And then I finished, and I got married, and I had a kid, and a kid, and a kid, and I'm a doctor. I should know how that happens. But I was really, really busy. I had a full-time job, husband, kids, house, you name it. And like so many people, I was really too busy to even consider my spiritual life or consider that whole realm of existence. And I think it's like most people, because you don't have to think about it until you have to. Most people don't think about death until you're forced to, until you either lose a loved one or you're diagnosed with a fatal disease or something. At that point in my life, I had lost no one that I actually knew. No one close to me, no relatives, no friends, no nothing. And so I had never actually thought about death as it pertained to me. I had patients die and that sort of thing, but that's a very abstract sort of experience. And that's how I lived. I took my kids to church, but I think I was sort of a cultural Christian in that I took them primarily because I wanted to give them a moral foundation. I wanted them to actually understand that there is right and wrong, but it really had little to do with developing their spiritual life. And that all changed for me in 1999. But we would get further down, and finally we came to this archway, this sort of entrance, and it was clearly the point of no return. And I wasn't coming back, and so I kept trying to say, okay, let's get over this line. But we were there for what felt like many hours, and I'm not going to go into it because many of you all have had this experience. I had an absolute understanding, not necessarily of the nature of the universe, but how it all works, how we can actually all be entirely interconnected, and not just people, animals, plants, the entire deal, how it is that we are all one. And I just wanted to stay there forever. And then at a certain point in time, I was told that it wasn't my time. I had more work to do on Earth, and I'm being kicked out. And I said, no, I'm good. I don't have to go back. I had already been reassured that everyone would be fine. So I tried to argue my point, but I am not an attorney. I am a doctor. So I was kicked out. And when I sort of revolted, they did start to tell me about some of the work I still had to do. And I have to tell you that it was not a feeling. It wasn't a sense of things that I had to do. It was pretty clear cut. It was like, okay, here's this list of things for you. There was nothing, not a single thing. Every single thing on this list is something that I knew was going to be very challenging, probably very painful, and definitely not something I felt up for doing. I didn't feel like I had the skills, the knowledge, you name it, this whole list. And some of the things on the list have come to pass, some of them have not yet, but they were all horrible, painful, and outside of my experience would be very difficult to do. I mean, some of it, and I'm not going to get into it this morning, I mean, some of it had to do with the coming and unexpected death of my oldest son. You saw the picture. He was only 9. And I was told about his coming death, and when I asked the obvious question of, well, why? Why my son? Why now? I was immediately taken back to my life review and reminded and shown yet again the reality that beauty comes of all things. And I had been shown that again and again and again. And then I was taken back to my body and reunited with my body, and it was a long process of getting home. And finally, I mean, I was in dire straits. And I was in the hospital for 5 or 6 weeks. I was in rehab for many, many months. And that really was the beginning of my trying to figure out what had happened to me. I needed to know what had happened, how this had happened. And I wanted to find a medical scientific explanation. I was desperate to find an explanation. I knew that if I could find a reasonable scientific explanation, then, sadly, I'd have to discount the fun part of my experience. But I knew that then I could discount everything I'd been told, including what I'd been told about my son's coming death. And so I was pretty motivated. And I looked through all my medical records. I interviewed everyone who was at the river and in the emergency room and collected all of that sort of information I could. I did everything. I looked through every original article about so many of the explanations. I looked at dreams and hallucinations, but I'm going to skip over that because it was pretty obvious that that was not a reasonable explanation. I wasn't asleep. And then I thought about hypoxia, because when I talk to people, that's a pretty common thing. Like, oh, well, it was just, your low oxygen levels. I was like, well, I don't think that's it. I mean, 0 oxygen is different than low. But I thought, okay. But one of the problems is that when you have even just hypoxia, low oxygen levels, you can't make ATP. And ATP is really the powerhouse of the cells in the body, and that power maintains the cell membrane. And when you can't do that, the cell just sort of gives up the ship. It says, okay, fine, calcium out, neurotransmitters out. And you have this dumping of both calcium and neurotransmitters. And calcium is extremely toxic to the other cells and sort of the brain structure, as are neurotransmitters. The other thing is that it destroys the brain cells that are most sensitive to and most responsible for creation of new memories and retention of new memories. So if I'm going to think that neurotransmitter dumping was responsible for my experience, then I have to discount the science that shows the part of my brain that would have been most likely to be affected was not. But then I focused on the neurotransmitters because that truly is what people look to. And dopamine, we all experience dopamine highs. That's why running and everything else like that is really great, because it creates a euphoria. But it does not create auditory or visual hallucinations. Serotonin isn't really a great thing. If you have too much serotonin, you feel very agitated, you can get seizures. But then I really focused on DMT, because that truly is the darling of, well, I call it darling of my time, because DMT is the handy excuse for anyone who wants to discount the reality of near-death experiences. And DMT has been called the God particle because it does create a dissociation. It does create a different sense of time and space, and people can have euphoria and hallucinations. But it's very interesting because almost all the DMT experiences have hallucinations that have to do with repeating geometric patterns. They're called machine elves. And it's interesting to me because I think the fact that what we describe in near-death experiences is different speaks to the truth of them. As an orthopedic surgeon, I can pretty much tell you what your experience is going to be if you break your arm. There's a little bit difference in terms of pain experience, but it's a physiologic process. I can pretty much tell you what the next 6 or 8 weeks of your life is going to be like. Similarly, with DMT experiences, DMT experiencers can pretty much tell you what the experience is going to be like, the things that you might see, the things that you might hear. But with near-death experiences, you know, we all describe this incredibly intense love, and we all describe incredible beauty, but it's different because we are different. Here on Earth, we describe beauty differently. We experience beauty differently. And so I think it speaks to the truth of them rather than it being a physiologic experience. But with DMT also, you know, we all say, oh yeah, well, it's found in the pineal gland and, you know, that releases at the time of death. Well, the fact is it's never been found. Someone found an enzyme that has a capacity to convert a couple of other things to DMT, but they've never actually found DMT in humans. And if they did, it's incredibly toxic, again, to the exact part of the brain that creates and retains new memories. And so I could go on and on and on, but ultimately, I had to come to the conclusion that mine was a true and real spiritual experience. It was outside the bounds of medicine, outside the bounds of science. And I also realized this false choice. I mean, we're all, I mean, even today, it doesn't matter what your age, we're expected to choose science or spirituality. But I discovered they coexist very easily because they address different questions. I'm still a scientist. I'm still analytical. And I expect science to help me explain how things happen. But I expect my spiritual reality to show me why. And so they coexist very easily. Obviously, I, like most of you, I'm not afraid of dying again. I mean, death to me is not the point. I mean, death brings context to life. Death brings meaning to life. But when I think about death, I think about this. It's my airplane ticket to home. This is the vacation. This is the great adventure. And then I get to go home. And the people I've met on my great adventure, well, you know, they're sorry that I'm leaving. And I'm sorry to leave because during my adventure, I love people. I make great friends. But I also know that I'm going home to where I've lived my whole life. I'm going home to the people who have loved me as long as I've existed.
A big medical school in Boston, and had all the academic checks and won teaching awards and written books. So it was that was the focus of my life at the time, and was work. So that's kind of where I was. Philosophically, I was an atheist, hardcore. You couldn't convince me otherwise. And with my work, just really reinforced that, because I can cut a brain and I can put it out for you. And I'll ask you, where's consciousness? Where's the soul? This doesn't exist. There's no proof for it in this brain. And everything that we think about as that process of consciousness, death, is the dying brain. And it can be very easily explained through hypoxia, the chemical reactions that happen as the brain begins to die, which do happen. But we get into confusing awareness with consciousness, but that's maybe another day. So that's where I was, at the time, and wasn't really anything I ever thought about. Wasn't part of my life to worry about these kind of questions. I was more concerned with getting publications on my CV and finishing a book that I had just written with a colleague that we were about to start a big book tour. And who I am as a husband, a father, a human, my place on the planet. So that's been incredible. And I think as physicians, we all try to practice this thing called evidence-based medicine, which we need data and proof to treat patients so that they can get the best care possible. And through that, we really pathologize death. We sterilize it. We try to prevent it. We medicalize it, and we shield ourselves from it. Funerals happen very quickly after death. It's very fast. No one sees the body, and you go very quickly back into life. We're not experiencing death. We've made it so sterile and kept it behind this curtain that we don't get a chance to really experience and celebrate the transformation that is happening. And I think as physicians, it's not I think back to all the times as a forensic pathologist, I knocked on doors to tell people that loved ones were dead. I brought people down into the morgue to identify bodies. I've sat with families in very horrible circumstances. And the number one question I've always been asked is, did they suffer? And as a physician, you always say, no, of course not. This was sudden, and we try to comfort them. But I always felt like a liar because I don't know, right? Now I know. And I wish I could talk to those people again and say, look, this is a beautiful thing. And even under these horrible circumstances, the horrible circumstance is a second. The process after that is incredible. And there's nothing to worry about in that regard. And I say that, no amount of, worry will transform your future. No amount of grief is going to fix your past. And you just have to be where you are right now and love that. And I think that is kind of where I am with it now.
Ho un'altra persona che ha dei ricordi per certi versi credo simili a quello che ci ha raccontato il nostro amico viennese, ed è il professor Graziano Sizzotti. Lei è un chirurgo vascolare e ha avuto, penso, le stesse. Ci vuole raccontare la sua esperienza?
Sì, grazie. Dunque, nel mio è stato uno shock emorragico post-operatorio. Ho perso conoscenza. Ricordo che prima di perdere conoscenza sono stato invaso da un dolcissimo languore. Dopodiché non ricordo più nulla di reale, di concreto, se non una realtà.
Tenga vicino il microfono,
in una dimensione
professore.
diversa, cioè ho visto il mio corpo sdraiato nel letto dell'ospedale.
Quindi è il corpo astrale, quello che viene chiamato corpo astrale.
I nostri colleghi qui presenti sono molto più esperti
Professore,
di me
allora lei
per
cosa
darmi
ha
queste
visto? Il suo
spiegazioni.
corpo che si staccava dal corpo che era sul letto.
Sì, e ho visto mia moglie vicino al letto, vicino al mio, che piangeva. Dopodiché sono stato avvicinato da due figure diafane, trasparenti, e da queste accompagnato nello spazio cosmico. Non ho visto tunnel come invece di solito viene visto. In questo spazio cosmico io viaggiavo su un tappeto di luce.
Beh, ma è un racconto straordinario.
Mentre le due figure diafane non avevano bisogno della luce per essere trasportati. A un certo punto, cioè io vedevo lo spazio.
Tenga il microfono
le
vicino a lei, sta
stelle.
facendo un racconto troppo bello, professore, ce lo faccia sentire bene. Tenga il microfono vicino.
Ecco, va bene, così
allora,
va
queste
bene.
due figure che, come degli andri, mi pare di capire.
Questo un po' fa parte della nostra cultura, comunque
certo.
le ali non le avevano.
Certo.
Ad un certo punto ci siamo fermati, vedevo le stelle intorno, vedevo buio, sentivo la presenza dei miei genitori defunti ma non li ho visti, e ad un certo punto ci siamo fermati su una specie di altipiano. A questo punto io ho sentito una voce, stranamente parlava in italiano, una voce, ma non ho visto da chi, la persona, la figura che parlava. E si è rivolto ai due accompagnatori e ha detto: ma cosa avete fatto? Vi siete sbagliati, riportatelo indietro.
Beh, ma è
Questo è l'ultimo ricordo di quella esperienza. Dopodiché io non ricordo il viaggio di ritorno.
Io vorrei sapere...
Quando mi sono svegliato alle 2 di notte, c'era mia moglie vicino a me e io mi sono rivolto a lei e le ho chiesto, ho avuto un'emorragia, vero? Dice sì, ma non ho detto da niente. Ho detto no, deve essere stata un'emorragia molto forte perché mi hanno fatto numerose trasfusioni. E lei mi ha detto ma no, guarda, ma questa è una trasfusione, ce l'avevo.
Poi è un medico, un chirurgo
e lei mi ha detto è solo la seconda. E io ho detto no, guarda, non prendermi in giro, questa è almeno l'ottava, ed era l'ottava.
Vorrei dire un qualche cosa sotto il profilo neurochimico.
Sì.
Parlando poco fa col collega che ha vissuto direttamente questa esperienza, lui diceva giustamente, in effetti le cause che portano a questa premorte sono le più svariate, però c'è un dato di fatto comune sotto il profilo medico, e cioè che alla fine quello che c'è lì nel cervello è una riduzione dell'apporto di ossigeno, cioè ci troviamo in una situazione comunque di ischemia. Cioè praticamente in quella fase c'è una riduzione del sangue che alimenta in quella zona.
E queste visioni possono essere originate?
Ecco, quindi il secondo passaggio è questo qui. Cosa succede sotto il profilo neurochimico in una situazione di questo tipo? Succedono due cose fondamentalmente. Da una parte abbiamo una riduzione dei trasmettitori, cioè di quei messaggeri di cui abbiamo parlato tante volte, di tipo inibitorio, e questo va proprio collegato a quanto dicevi tu poco fa, cioè si riducono le inibizioni e quindi si ha teoricamente una possibilità di espansione delle capacità cerebrali, e poi si aumenta massicciamente la liberazione di altri neurotrasmettitori, cioè di questi messaggeri.
Ecco, questo è il punto che poi si raccorda anche al tunnel di luce. Cioè io sono andato, ovviamente lì ero completamente out, quando dopo credo 3 o 4 giorni che ero in coma profondo ho avuto questa visione, e cioè mi trovavo in questo tunnel di luce meravigliosa e camminavo lungo questo tunnel di luce felice di lasciarmi alle spalle tutti i dolori, malanni, eccetera, eccetera, ma poi venivo attratto fortissimamente da questa luce straordinaria, che era una luce positiva. Quindi qui c'è un incrocio comunque di una parte scientifica, eccetera, con cui tu puoi cercare di spiegare tutto, però c'è anche un qualche cosa, c'è che questo non è che sono io il primo, ce ne sono centinaia e centinaia di storie di questo tipo. Che a fianco al radiologo guardava tutte le immagini dell'attack, faceva un attack total body di tutto il mio corpo, che lui aveva lasciato alcuni mesi prima pieno di metastasi, e vedo Giovanni che è un tipo molto calmo, tranquillo, che invece piangeva, e allora io ho detto va bene, è andata, e invece quello è venuto, mi ha abbracciato, ha detto papà è quasi scomparso, cioè praticamente più dell'80% del tumore era andato via. Poi fatto in seguito altri controlli, Maurizio, fatti ancora degli altri controlli a distanza di 4 mesi, successivamente poi è scomparso completamente, adesso ci sono solamente delle cicatrici. Quindi, forse ci sarà anche qualche ragione per la quale pure mi hanno fatto tornare, e questo me lo sono domandato, me lo sono chiesto e me lo continuo a chiedere. Forse una delle ragioni è proprio quella che stiamo facendo questa mattina, è quello che stiamo dicendo, non bisogna arrendersi, perché ci sono situazioni estreme che però trovano la possibilità di soluzione. Allora ci sono due considerazioni da fare qui, molto vicine, sovrapponibili, intrecciate, eccetera. Da una parte, tu sai, io sono un professore di neuroscienze, ho vissuto per 40 anni di questo, lavorando sul rapporto fra cervello, sistema immunitario, sistema endocrino, quindi insomma abbastanza approfondito nella materia scientifica, e teoricamente sarei dovuto essere scettico rispetto a quello che vedevo, quello che ho visto o come si interpreta, ma qua c'è una parte spirituale che non si può trascurare. Non si può trascurare questo tunnel di luce, perché guarda, tu potresti anche dare delle spiegazioni scientifiche estremamente rigide, che c'è qualche cosa nella nostra antica memoria, nell'ippocampo che ci portiamo dentro e che in certe condizioni spara fuori questa sorta di tunnel di luce, eccetera. Però io ti devo dire che ho sentito veramente con tutto il cuore, ho sentito che c'era qualcosa di più, c'era qualcosa che andava al di là, andava oltre. E siccome ci sono centinaia e centinaia di questi casi,
tutti così,
e che tutti descrivono questo,
nel 1500 già
faceva questo. Quindi siamo qualche cosa di più certamente di un pezzo di carne, siamo di più di un pezzo di cervello.
Voi avete conosciuto una persona che l'aldilà l'ha visto e poi ha preferito tornare indietro,
oppure vanno mandati indietro.
L'aldilà l'hai visto?
Io l'ho intravisto.
Sono felice del tuo racconto, sono felice dell'esperienza che tu hai vissuto, ma sono altrettanto felice che tu hai potuto raccontare agli altri questo, perché è una iniezione di coraggio.
E forse per questo può darsi che mi hanno mandato per questo.
Hai capito? È questo, e di questo io ti sono grato, proprio di aver regalato a chi ci ascolta
kind of this wonderful voyage of trying to put things together and understand exactly what it all means. And I thought I had a pretty good idea what it meant and how things worked before my coma, but I really didn't. And I've learned so much, and certainly meeting the people involved in this journey, sharing in this journey, has been an absolute godsend. I think to start, you will find during this talk that I seem to like this guy. I kind of tend to quote him because I think he was pretty smart. A man should look for what is and not for what he thinks should be. And that's what we're all here doing, is exactly that. Just kind of briefly want to talk about my background, and Bruce has already gone into a lot of this. I spent a total of 17 years at Harvard. 2 of those years were during my residency. I'm the one in the far end of the picture there, operating in the intraoperative MR we designed. So I was very much into academic neurosurgery, a very scientific career, very kind of rigorous treatment of neuroscience, working of brain and mind. And I thought I had a really good idea of how the brain and the mind and consciousness work. I had grown up in a religious family. My father was in the Army Air Force, a neurosurgeon in the Pacific World War II. I thought I had a very good idea about, as I say here, preconceptions of the nervous system, how it evolved, how the human brain, in a sense, was kind of the ultimate thinking machine in the universe. And I think that kind of assumption can be very, very misleading. I will discuss what we call reductive materialism, kind of the classical scientific view, and that is one where basically by reducing the systems down to their finest elements and fundamental parts and elucidating the various interrelationships, you can describe everything. And in fact, I think a lot of the trap of modern science is thinking that reductive materialism is a pathway to understanding all of reality. And I will point out where that has a very gaping flaw that I think explains a lot, especially along the lines of near-death experiences. A major part of that assumption, as much as I wanted to believe in an afterlife, wanted to believe in a loving God and that prayers might be answered, fact of the matter was my life, everything about my career, everything I knew said that the mind and the soul, by extension, depends on a functional brain. It was very hard for me to see how you could get around that particular issue. I think something else that, and of course, it's kind of preaching to the choir, but people who have been there know that what we put down in our human kind of literature and religious texts and all that, depicting God and angels, a lot of that came along from centuries of human experience, and it's extremely limiting. I mean, I basically look at the linguistic brain, that rational voice, the one that I spent 20 some odd years educating, to get into academic neurosurgery. But what that does is defines and it limits. And what we find in going beyond this realm into that much more powerful spiritual realm is that a lot of those definitions are far too limiting, and that very much inhibits what people are able to see from this realm if they haven't been able to get there. And I think that's something I would like to try and convey to people who haven't been there. And I think it certainly you don't have to die, to see it and to get there. There are other ways to do it, and we'll talk about all of that. As I said, I grew up in a religious family. My father was quite spiritual. It turns out another part of the puzzle that I will get into that actually was the most important key of all in my sorting all this out is that I was adopted. And my oldest son, who unfortunately is not here today, Eben IV, was doing a 6th grade project in the year 1999. It involved a family tree and looking at your heritage. And he wanted me to, again, try and get some information about our biological heritage. And so I wrote a letter to the children's home asking them once again if there was any contact. And I'll get into that story in detail later. Suffice to say for now that in 2000 I found out that there was more information, but that it was not a good time for me to come back into their lives. And that ended up having an impact on my faith and belief in prayer and everything. I didn't recognize it at the time, not as such. I didn't see the connection. But I had a very serious decline in my faith beginning in 2000 for those 8 years until I went into a coma. And I would say during that time, at best, I could say that God, in my view, might be the omniscient creator, but certainly wouldn't have time for individuals or planet Earth or humanity or anything else. And I saw the universe as an indifferent machine. And I do remember hearing at one point that towards the end of his life, a journalist asked Einstein if he could have the answer to one question. What would that question be? And he didn't hesitate at all. And it was, is the universe benevolent or not? That is, does it even care? And I think he found that answer very quickly in 1955. I found the answer in 2008, and I'm sure many people in this room know the answer to that. And we will certainly get into that going into my story. So I want to take you back 4:30 in the morning, November 10th, 2008.
Ora so che esiste una realtà molto più ricca di significato, profonda ed eterna, che è alla base di tutto. Questa realtà potremo vederla solo quando lasceremo il nostro cervello e il nostro corpo. Il paradiso è una realtà legata a quel Dio d'amore che è al centro di tutto. Nessuna religione è la religione giusta. Infatti ciascuno di noi nella profondità dell'anima può incontrare Dio e sperimentare il suo legame intimo con Lui. Questo è il vero paradiso. È qualcosa di reale. La scienza e la fede possono sostenersi a vicenda, ma la scienza attuale deve allargare i propri orizzonti per abbracciare in modo completo il mistero insondabile della coscienza e dell'anima, che esistono anche al di là della vita.
and got my education in biology. When I was there, my last year, I had the honor of working with Albert St. Georgi, who was a Nobel Prize winner, who defined the way muscle worked. At that time, it made me realize that that's what I wanted to do. And I kind of had this vision of being one of the lab rats that worked in the basement of some big institution and learned all kinds of great things. So I decided to go to graduate school, and I spent the next 5 years getting my doctorate in physiology with a minor in biophysics. And I thought, I'm going to go to medical school. At the end of it, I was trying to decide what kind of a physician I wanted to be. And I settled on orthopedics because I always was one of those kids that loved taking things apart, putting them back together and rebuilding things. I'm standing here and I'm thinking exactly the way I normally would. I have complete control of my mind, and I'm thinking in the vernacular and the way that I normally would think. And I'm having these massive racing thoughts are going through my head trying to make sense of this whole thing. But I realized at that moment that whoever I am, I always am. And there's no such thing as death. And my spirit, or whoever I was, is eternal. And that was probably the first big thing, that realization that came to me as this whole thing unfolded, was that my spirit is here forever. So we're essentially two people. You know, we're in this body, which is nothing more than a costume, over the top of who we are always. I walked around the front of the building where there was a payphone attached. What I hadn't realized was that a storm cloud had blown up over the lake, and so we're right next to the lake. So I walk over and I'm going to call my mom, and I put in the code in the phone, and I'm trying to get her on the payphone, and I heard a huge crack. And this big flash of light came out of the phone and hit me right in the face and just threw me back like a rag doll. I fully expected that when you died, something would happen to tell you, you know, bells, whistles, who knows what. But there wasn't. It was just a very natural progression of, I was in this state this second, and the next second I was someplace else. I went from being in a physical form to being in a spiritual form. And in our spirit form. And, you know, when I went up to the body and I looked at it, and it seemed to be very dispassionate about it. It was like, that's me, but it's not. You know, I'm me. I'm still who I always was, and that's nothing but an empty shell. And that was pretty earth-shaking. It was not a frightening experience. It was, you know, it was just very matter-of-factly, this is the way things really are. And then I thought, well, there's no point in standing here because nobody can see me or hear me. And I turned around and I start to walk toward the stairs, and I'm going to go up the stairs and check on my family. And I started up the stairs, and I got to about the third step, and I'm looking down at the ground, and I start to see my legs dissolve. And I thought, well, okay, this is getting really weird. And as I got to the top of the stairs, I had lost all form. I was just a ball of energy. The stairs, when you get to the top of the first level, it goes up another few steps to the left. And I didn't bother with that. I had no form. I just went through the wall. And when I came out on the other side of the wall, I came out right over the top of my wife, who was sitting painting children's faces. And I remember taking a picture in my head of of who was there, what kids were there, how the furniture was arranged, and what order the kids were standing in. And that became an important issue later on when we were comparing notes, and I was able to say all of these things that verified the fact that, yeah, I did see it, and I was there. I continued going through that room, and when I got out of the room and went through the roof, and that's when things really got interesting, it was like I had suddenly fallen into a river of pure positive energy. There was a bluish-white light that this energy emanated from. If you can imagine an energy that's completely composed of love and peace, there were no other emotions, no other senses that I had except that. And it was just earth-shaking to feel that much love and peace coming from this source. At that point, I was just kind of settling into flowing in the stream. I didn't know where it was going or where it was taking me, but it was exciting. And it was an ecstasy. It was such a wonderful feeling. And then all of a sudden, it's like somebody flipped a switch. Suddenly, I was in pain. And I was back in my body, calling out loud in my head. One thing that I have found with the music is that it takes me about as close to that feeling, that euphoria of being on the other side, as I can get. It's almost like there's a connection that I can access. It's a frequency that I'm able to tune into. And, in reading about other composers, the great composers all said the same thing. Mozart was most prolific about it. And he said, the music would come to me in finished form. And all I did was write it down. And, lots of people have speculated that our brain is nothing more than a receiver. There's no way in the world it could house all the information that we have access to. There's some off-site place that we are able to communicate with. Life exists after death. We're in this form for a certain period of time, and then we leave this form and we become something else. So it's just a continuum of existence. You keep going through this process, you re-experience, and to evolve spiritually into a higher being than what we are now. The way I look at it is everybody can go back to the source, but you have to earn your way back. And you do that by going through proving grounds, if you will. You experientially develop. There's two polarities. There's positive and negative. And moving along a positive polarity is service to others as opposed to the negative, which is service to self. And if you can think along the line of service to others in your daily life, then that gives you a more of an advantage to grow spiritually. This was the greatest thing that I've ever experienced in my life. I was given an opportunity to see what happens after death. Death is not to be feared. It's just a changing form. You still exist as whoever you are and always will be. Before the lightning experience, I was very grounded in science in terms of, what is reality. And now I completely understand that there's much more to our existence than we have any idea of. If everybody could experience that before they die, they would have a whole different perspective on life and what we're doing here, and it would change everything.
In coda a questo video presento un accenno su un argomento che poi tratterò più approfonditamente con i vari dati in un video apposito. Immaginiamo di avere un fenomeno su cui siamo tutti d'accordo, ma che può portare a due conseguenze differenti, totalmente alternative, e una di queste due conseguenze ha una probabilità del 99,998% e l'altra dello 0,002%. Come è possibile che intellettuali del calibro di Margherita Hack, Oddi Freddi, Galimberti, Crépé credano alla eventualità che ha lo 0,002% di essere vera? Chiaramente, come si è ben capito, il fatto su cui tutti concordiamo è la morte del nostro corpo fisico. Quello invece su cui c'è da sempre nella storia dell'uomo un dibattito è sul fatto che possa sopravvivere o meno una componente immateriale dell'essere umano e in generale degli esseri viventi. Abbiamo visto un video dove sono presentate 3 medici specialisti che hanno avuto esperienze di NDE e hanno anche riportato dei riscontri veridici all'interno di queste esperienze. Abbiamo il dottor Parti che ha potuto dall'esterno del proprio corpo vedere coloro che lo stavano operando e ha ascoltato la barzelletta raccontata dal chirurgo, che poi effettivamente ha confermato questa circostanza successivamente. Sempre il dottor Parti riferisce di essere stato nella casa della propria madre, in cui c'era anche la sorella, e ha potuto anche in questo caso riscontrare gli abiti e i discorsi fatti successivamente. Poi abbiamo visto il dottor Alexander che afferma di aver visto una ragazza che lo guidava in questo mondo, in questa dimensione durante il suo coma, e aver solo dopo un paio di mesi scoperto attraverso una foto che gli era pervenuta dalla sua famiglia naturale che quella ragazza era la propria sorella. Infine abbiamo sentito la testimonianza della dottoressa Neal, che insieme a tante altre cose è rimasta soprattutto colpita dalla previsione che le era stata fatta della morte del proprio figlio al compimento dei 18 anni. Analizziamo un attimo questi 3 fatti molto rapidamente in questa sede e vedremo un attimino un riassunto delle conclusioni. Per quanto riguarda il dottor Parti, sono molto specifiche, i riscontri sono molto specifici, però è difficile dare un peso statistico a questi elementi, anche se riguardo la mamma e la sorella ci sarebbe anche uno spazio di possibilità. Ma accantoniamo questo fatto. Il dottor Alexander, ecco, invece in questo caso abbiamo un possibile fenomeno di sovrapposizione a posteriori delle esperienze, quindi possiamo dire che lui potrebbe aver, una volta visto la foto della sorella, forzato in qualche modo i suoi ricordi in modo da fare sovrapporre le 2 ragazze. Però c'è un fatto, lui aveva notato un elemento: gli occhi blu, che assimileremo al carattere azzurro, e i capelli di una certa tonalità di castano, dunque perlomeno certamente non biondi e non rossi. E allora, basandoci solo su questi due elementi caratteristici e sulla loro incidenza statistica negli Stati Uniti, otteniamo una probabilità composta stimabile attorno al 16%. E dunque, anche supponendo che tutti gli altri elementi del riconoscimento siano stati alterati per un meccanismo psicologico, le probabilità che occhi e capelli coincidessero per caso sarebbero state solo del 16%. E poi abbiamo la dottoressa Neal, che invece ha riportato questa previsione della morte del figlio. Previsione che lei l'ha motivata moltissimo, abbiamo visto e ascoltato, a cercare delle spiegazioni alternative dell'esperienza, cercare di dimostrare che poteva essere una fantasia proprio per liberarsi da questo peso, ma in realtà un paio d'anni dopo, al compimento dei 18 anni, 2 o 3 anni dopo, il figlio è effettivamente morto in un incidente stradale. E in questo caso io ho analizzato un pochino le statistiche che mi era più facile consultare, ovvero le statistiche italiane ed europee riguardanti gli incidenti stradali, cosa che poi presenterò poi nello specifico, e prendendo un margine anche molto elevato, quindi della possibilità che questo suo figlio che aveva 10 anni morisse nella fascia tra gli 11 e i 24 anni, le possibilità che si verificasse appunto un decesso per incidente stradale in questa ampia fascia di età era appunto dello 0,002%. Inoltre lei aveva 3 figli e la previsione riguardava non uno generico dei figli, ma specificamente il figlio maggiore, ed è proprio quello che si è verificato. A questo punto, considerando la credibilità comunque di queste persone, che sono medici specializzati, e le probabilità che si possono associare a questi riscontri che hanno riportato, possiamo dire che comunque se diamo credito alla dottoressa avremmo un 99,998%, che effettivamente quella previsione derivasse da un qualcosa di reale, mentre se anche volessimo pensare che uno tra i 3 medici non fosse attendibile, dovremmo comunque trarre una probabilità superiore al 99%. Quindi da queste testimonianze risulta veramente difficile per una persona profondamente razionale pensare che la morte del corpo comporti la morte totale dell'essere vivente. Grazie.